Hi class. The next two things we're going to talk about are really getting into more sophisticated statistical techniques. The two things we're going to talk about, two-way ANOVA and regression, are really things that are going to be model building, where instead of having one variable that's an independent variable and one variable that's a dependent variable, and seeing how those two things are related in some way, we're now going to be having multiple variables in a model. And this is sometimes a little bit more like real life. Sometimes things are complicated and there's more than one predictor for some outcome. You can think about it in terms of alcoholism. Certainly there are environmental factors with alcoholism. Growing up in a family with alcoholics, and that environment can influence someone to become an alcoholic later in life. But there's also genetics. You might carry a genetic, a gene, a genetic predisposition for that particular disorder. And then also there's personality variables. Being someone prone to risk-taking might make someone more likely to abuse substances. So there's a whole host of factors, personality, environmental, genetics, that might lead to someone having a substance abuse problem. And this type of problem is really more like the real world in that sometimes there's more than one issue or causal factor you think leads to some particular outcome. So the two-way ANOVA is something that looks at the effect of at least two independent variables on one dependent variable. So you have two things that you think are related in some way to the dependent and may be related to each other in a particular way. The simplest design is a 2 by 2 factorial design. What that means is that you have two independent variables and they each have two levels to them. So say you were interested in something like gender, which has two levels, male and female, and voting preference, Republican or Democrat, which has two levels, on something like charitable contributions and giving. So gender would have two levels, voting preference would have two levels, and then you would look at those two things on some particular outcome, such as charitable giving. The two things you can get from an ANOVA, that's a two-way ANOVA, that you don't get from a one-way ANOVA or a more simple test are main effects, so the effects of each variable by itself on the dependent variable, and interactions, the effect of one independent variable depending on the particular level of the other independent variable. So I have here a graph from something that is a fairly well-known social psychology experiment, and something that was sort of difficult for people in the field to reconcile. So you had a lot of literature saying that when you had to perform, so here we have performance scores, when you had to perform in front of a group, sometimes people would bomb out. They would do absolutely horrible. And then there was another body of literature that was saying, well, sometimes when people were performing in front of a group, there was social facilitation. That is, performing something in front of a group actually made you do better. And you can think of this. Sometimes, right, you've been at the bar, you've been playing pool, everything's going great, you're sinking every shot, your friends come in, you're, hey, come watch me play pool, and then all of a sudden it just, goes south. You can't get anything in, and your friends think you're making the whole thing up all the time. And other times, maybe you had a music recital as a kid, and you were so scared and so nervous and so anxious, but then you got up on stage and boom, you hit all the notes, you put emotion into it, everyone clapping, great, everyone thought you did great. So what's going on? You have these two bodies of literature saying crowds or people can enhance performance, or crowds or people can really detract from performance. And what ended up happening was that really they discovered it was really more of a two-way ANOVA design, that there was another issue in there in terms of level of anxiety. And level of anxiety, of course, has to do with how much you've practiced, how well you're capable of doing something. Is it an easy task or is it a hard task? So if you have practiced something and you are really, really good at it, you've done your 10,000 hours of practice, it becomes an easy task. And for an easy task, when you are under high levels of anxiety, you actually perform better. So with that piano recital, if you put in your 10,000 hours of practice and you were practicing, when you were playing it for your parents at home or maybe your music teacher, you kind of did okay. But under conditions where you had a crowd of people, you really just soared. You really were able to take something that you were good at, and that excitement, that little bit of anxiety that the audience gave you, just made you perform all that much better. However, a hard task kind of has the opposite effect. So with a hard task, if nobody's watching, if you haven't practiced and you're not particularly good at it, that hard task, when nobody's watching, you do pretty good. But then when people come over and they start watching you, you get that anxiety, people are watching you, but you're not very good at the task. And what ends up happening is you actually perform far worse than if you were just left alone and no one was seeing you do it. And really the difference there is the level of anxiety and how easy or hard you find the task, right? So the main effect is, anxiety level impacts performance on task, and the difficulty of the task impacts how you do on the task. So each of those two variables by themselves impact performance. But what the ANOVA gives you, the two-way ANOVA gives you that you couldn't get with a one-way ANOVA, is the interaction. That the level of performance, how well you're going to do, depends not just on how anxious you are, but also how good you are at that particular task. And that really, that sort of pulling together of all the literature really reconciled a lot of the, disparate findings in the social facilitation literature. So you can think of it as, do you have an experiment that you're proposing for your project where you have more than one independent variable, and each of those independent variables has two or more levels. If you do, you might consider, rather than running two one-way ANOVAs, putting them into a two-way ANOVA. It'll give you the main effects, which is basically what you would get by running the one-way ANOVA, but it also gives you the potential of looking for interaction effects where the relationship between the variables might be more complex than you would get just by looking at it through a one-way. Again, the constraints on this particular analysis are that your independent variables have to be categorical and your outcome variable has to be continuous, just like with the one-way ANOVA, but in this case you're just adding and creating a model.